Hey there, Business of Unicorns podcast listeners. This is Mark, and I'm here to tell you about an awesome free resource on businessforunicorns.com. If you ever find yourself feeling frustrated with your training gym because you know that there are all sorts of things you could work on, but you're not really sure how to prioritize, you don't know what's the most important thing to work on or what order you should be tackling your priorities, well, now is the time to go to businessforunicorns.com, click the button, and fill out our free self-assessment. With the Ultimate Training Gym Owner Report Card, you will gain immediate clarity on just where to be focusing your attention to create more positive impact on your community, to drive more revenue and take home income, and to do it all with less stress and more peace of mind. So go to businessofunicorns.com, click the button, fill out that free self-assessment, and start building a business and life you love today.
Well, hello, fitness business nerds. What's up, my friends? Welcome to another episode of the Business for Unicorns podcast. And today we got the whole crew here. We got Pete and got Fisher, and we're talking about a fun topic, one that might have to be part one of this topic, because we have time to record a short podcast today, so we might have to have more to say on this topic. But what we're going to talk about today is the value and importance of having trackable numbers and metrics for your team's performance. And briefly, the reason we think this is crucially important is because, if you want to continuously improve the business, in our business, that often means improving your team's performance. Our business gets better and better as our team does a better and better job of creating an amazing experience for our clients. And without numbers to track that align with your team's performance, often the conversation is really wishy-washy. It's like, well, I think my team's doing pretty good. They're pretty nice. They're doing a good job. And what we're suggesting is that that's not enough, right? Sure, you might want to do some qualitative tracking of, getting testimonials and surveys and things like that have qualitative data. But quantitative tracking, we're actually counting the numbers of certain behaviors that are key to success in your organization. That's where you get some real benefits. And so, Fisher, I'm going to ask you to kick this one off and just talk a little bit about, just big picture, how do you think about tracking key metrics for individual performance in the business? And what are some that you think everyone should think about tracking?
Oh, gosh, this is hard. I'll do my very best to be concise here. So to just jump into what this might look like in the average training gym, the most obvious one is getting some numeric subjective feedback about your trainer's performance. So this can look like a lot of different things depending on how big your facility is, depending on whether this is a once every 2 months email to all your members, or if you're using some software platform that allows you to automate this. And the sexier ones will automatically email new clients the first time they experience a coach, and then we'll know to not email them again until 3 months later. So that creates a really useful popcorning effect to get you a steady stream of data. But something like ranking your coach's session overall on a scale of 1 to 10, or potentially on a number of different qualities of what you're looking for. If you're able to track that over time in some kind of dashboard, you can really start to see trends about how your coaches are performing. I think another quantitative metric that you can use for coaches, which again is not perfect like all of these, could be utilization, right? Tracking how full are your coach's sessions can tell you something. Now, here's a great example of all models are wrong, some are useful. The imperfection there, as you are intuiting correctly, is, well, somebody in prime time is going to be more full, usually, than someone that is in the middle of the afternoon. That's true. However, when you're doing your best to control for that, over time, you'll see trends. So utilization, to my mind, is a classic example of a metric that is valuable, is worth looking at, but has a very meaningful confounder that you will have to take into account as well. So that's one. So those ones I think are useful for trainer land. Now, I would share that you can go pretty far with this. And I must say, a lot of what has made my job way easier, and I think team morale better in the past couple years at MFAV, is we have really gone all in on this. So a couple ones that are a little bit more novel that maybe you could utilize. The trainers, and this isn't like a numeric tracking, but the trainers have a number of extra roles that they do outside of just performing the session. So this is the case in many training gyms, right? Trainers train the session, but maybe they have opening, closing responsibilities. Maybe there's some sort of client communication responsibility. At Mark Fisher Fitness, part of their role for which they're paid a separate monthly stipend, for instance, is engaging in our private Facebook groups. So we pay them separately for all of those things. Therefore, it's important that they're doing those things. Now, while the manager will still have to always inspect what they expect, a very valuable tool is every week, the trainers have to go into a checklist and just check off, did I do this things? And this is a very valuable tool for us because they're now doing with their weekly tasks, their extra tasks outside of their training hours, the way that you would have perhaps a front desk person have an opening checklist, right? So that's not strictly a number per se, but the reality is as soon as you're creating these kinds of systems, what gets measured gets managed. The last one I'll share, which we've used to great effect with everybody that is a salaried member at MFF, is I track how many hours per week they're spending on continuing education. So at everybody at MFF, to do the bare minimum, 2 hours, with the expectation being 2.5 hours really, because I expect we will pay you if you work a full-time week at MFF, 48 hours, 30 minutes per day, my expectation, you will be paid to spend on formal education. Now, I will also make the pitch that if one wants to be world-class, and not everybody does, unfortunately. Well, not unfortunately. People value different things. I get it, right? But if you want to kick ass in life, that's not it, right? That's like the bare minimum. You probably want to do an additional maybe 30 minutes of your own time, because I think once you're up to about 5 hours of continuing education per week, that's probably a good sweet spot. If you're doing a whole lot more than that, I start to wonder, are you using learning as a form of procrastination? But since that's part of what we pay them for at MFF, they just track that, and it's very easy. Now, the final step I'll add here, as far as how to apply this, is if you must inspect what you expect, which is to say that every meeting begins with a review of those metrics. I'm looking for those reds, and I'm not going to have an issue if it happens once in a while, but I am going to have conversations if and when I see trends, and my expectation is that my managers are doing the same for the people that report to them. So those are just some thoughts and hopefully some actionable tips.
Yeah, great. Same question for you, Pete. I mean, how do you think about, measuring what matters at Cressy for your team's performance, or anything that you do track consistently you find valuable?
I think it's important to open my thought with the note that my director of performance, John, is especially in tune with the numbers as it relates to team performance from a hours assigned to coaching and programming standpoint and some of the KPI that we track. So I want to put a tab on your forward thinking we're going to have this conversation again and say I'm going to voluntarily opt out of that one and see if I can get him into this conversation, because he's the person that I go to for these quantitative questions.
Yeah, that's great.
So, for example, I have found that my team will not raise their hand and say I'm burnt out. They just won't. They don't want to be the person who is coming across as a complainer. And right now, that's especially important to me. I've been saying for the last couple weeks on the podcast that we're going to double, triple, quadruple our foot traffic all at once. Well, it happened yesterday. Mm-hmm. And I am concerned of overdoing it with my team when we make a move like that. So I would walk up to John and I'd say, hey, John, what are we looking at from hours on the training floor standpoint for the team across the board? And he is so in tune with it, he'd say nobody has more than 36 or nobody has more than 39 hours on the training floor, and nobody has less than 36 this week. And all of them are going to be all in the 42 to 45 hour range this week from a program design, continuing ed standpoint, all of these things. And that's when I'd say, okay, is there anyone in particular that I needed to talk to just keep my finger on the pulse of where they're at from an output, energy, and headspace standpoint? And he'd say, you know what, Jordan, our pitching coordinator, is going to get smoked for the next 72 to 96 hours. Keep an eye on it. And that's where I am mashing those qualitative and quantitative components together and walking out and just being like, how you feeling? Mm-hmm. Can I pick up lunch for you today? Where's your head at? So they're not black and white to me. I need to use one to inform the other. And so that's kind of how I think about finger on the pulse of the numbers. The other way that the thing that came to me as we were saying this is that we make hiring decisions based off of these numbers. So again, the team won't say to me, I have way too many programs. I have way too many clients who I'm accountable to. And John and I have figured out, and more John than me, where the threshold is as far as total programs being put out by the staff and an average per head before we look at adding team members. And so they're very specific numbers. It might be we don't want anyone in excess of, I don't know, 38 clients that they're responsible for program design. And those numbers inform the decisions for making part and full-time hires. They just trigger it. They are the tripwire that we use rather than saying, hey, team, what do you think? None of them want to be like, you ask too much of me. I'm exhausted. They're all really good at being team players, but to a fault. So that's a long-ish answer to a question that I want John to answer for you on a recording in the future.
Yeah, I love that idea. I think that would be great to invite John to a part 2 of this, because I think there's so much more to say than we'll have time for today. Yeah, I mean, I'll add my 2 cents, which is I think all too often when people think about tracking quantitative metrics for their team's performance, they jump right to tracking outcomes instead of tracking effort. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes I see in our Unicorn Society folks. For example, they'll only track how many total sales they had, instead of tracking how many referral asks did we make.
Totally.
Right? How many Google review asks did we make? You know, how many text follow-ups did we do today, right? So there's something about tracking that, because I think to Fisher's point is if we have to measure what matters, you're communicating to your team what matters by what you measure, right? So when you tell them, I need everyone every week to ask at least 5 clients to bring a friend. I need everyone every week to ask at least 5 clients for a Google review. I need everyone every week to follow up with whoever came for their first session with 2 emails. Right? I need everyone every week who owns a lead to text them at least 4 times each week for the 2 weeks after our initial conversation. Right? What I'm doing is I'm saying these are the behaviors that matter, and I'm going to track your effort, not just the outcomes. Because if you're doing all the things I'm asking you to do, you did all the outreaches and all the asks, and then we're still not getting to the outcomes, then I either have a training issue and that you're not doing it well, or I've set the bar unreasonably high, and that's my bad, right? And there may be other nuanced reasons in there, but those are 2 of the main things I'd look at. And so I think when you can be clear on the consistent behaviors you want and track the effort, I think you get farther faster, because it's also more transparent. Yeah. And so let's just go to this, Fisher, because I know you mentioned this before we recorded, and I think we can probably spend our last 5 minutes talking about this, is that it's clear that we should, measure what matters, but what matters is not always very measurable, right? You can't always put a number on some of the things that really matters the most. And Pete, you spoke to this a little bit too, which is a little bit like, how's everyone feeling? It's like, yeah, you could make them keep a feelings diary and track on a scale of 1 to 5 how they feel you could make that quantitative, but really that's just not always the best way. So, how do we account for that? How do we account for the fact that we can't always, quantify the things we care the most about? What are your thoughts, Fisher?
Well, it's funnily enough. So Ben, the secret weapon Pickard, quite literally does that. Quite literally does a morale tracking. So I'm actually quite intrigued by that. I have to say the really wonderful thing about the past couple of years at MFF are, by all accounts, morale has been higher than it's ever been. It's right at these issues. Like, people are generally pretty happy and taking time off and are mostly doing pretty good. I'm aware, having run a business for a long time, there's always going to be ebbs and flows with those. But I actually think that tracking people's mindset, I can't remember, we should if we do a second one, bring Ben on here too, because I can't remember what it was, because everyone's like, what? That's genius. Because I think he has them rank their head state on like a red, green, or yellow on a weekly basis, just so he knows kind of where people are at. And I think that is a great way of turning that quantitative. I think that outside of the outcomes, I really want to highlight, I think the point is so true that we want to track behaviors as well as outcomes, in part because outcomes by definition are not always within our control. The behaviors are. So you're putting their focus on the things they can control, which we know is the same thing as like a fitness client. I think the other, and I wouldn't go so far as to say, oh, it's half numbers and it's half feelings. That's maybe crude, but I don't know, kind of. It's not a bad paradigm. When we are assessing someone's performance, right? If someone is doing the reviews, I would note one way this looks very specific is we're tracking all of these quantitative numbers on a yearly basis, but we are also going to do rankings on where the individual do self-rankings that the manager will also comment on about how they're showing up in reference to our 6 values at MFF. So I think doing some rankings around those values stuff will help. And I have found it to be valuable just to be upfront with people and just say, like, listen, there's a layer of this that's just always going to be subjective, right? We can't The numbers will help, but the numbers are imperfect. And there's always going to be some imperfect subjectivity, right? Because when you're looking, for instance, at pay raises at the end of the year, there are the actual numbers we've been tracking all along. There are the manager's assessment. There are the team members' assessment, because with our training team, at least historically, we've done 360-degree feedback on the values from the other team members. So some of that is always going to be subjective. And I think that's not without its peril either, because now you are invariably getting into opinions, but ultimately there's no other way, I think, to really process the qualitative feedback you're going to get all year long, right? Again, trainers are just easy, the most obvious example. You're going to get the numbers, but you're also going to get a lot of very specific comments. And there's not, I don't think, a very good algorithm, I think, to wait. Okay, well, so I've thought about this a lot. This is a weird thing. Follow me with this, training gym owners. How do you navigate between somebody that everybody thinks is good, fine, versus somebody that has people that are like, I will never leave your gym because this person is so incredible, but then maybe like 20% of people just do not like that trainer, right? And there's variations of that. It's usually not quite that. I would say maybe 5% of people will not train with that person. They find them obnoxious, but 25 to 30% of your clients are obsessed with that trainer. And not only that, there's no really good algorithm. Okay, well, what are the 30% of those clients? Are they your most beloved clients, big spenders, right? So invariably, I think some of this is not possible to be broken down to like math. And I think that's kind of okay. And the approach we've tried to take is just be very frank and candid with people that, we're going to do our best. This is not a perfect system, but I think the system is massively improved by the contribution of the numbers. And then the wisdom and just imperfect best attempts to judge fairly of the manager. Yeah.
What would you add to that, Pete?
I want to bring one point back that Mark mentioned pre-show that I think is important. I don't want it to be buried. Yeah. This habit of attaching metrics to how we evaluate performance and things like that insulates us from allowing our instincts and our misreading of the situation of employee performance to get in the way. So Mark used a different term than this, but we're talking about the brown nosers. And I have fallen victim to that. And I actually heard one of my favorite new terms recently in a podcast recently with Simon Sinek. Have either of you heard the term the tree of monkeys?
No.
Well, he described this dynamic as the tree of monkeys. When you are at the top, you're sitting at the top, you're the boss, and you look down and all you see is smiling faces. But if you're at the bottom, you look up and all you see is assholes. And this move insulates you from the tree of monkeys problem as the kind of blind or just unaware manager, leader, boss. And I would contend that we've all made this mistake. I've definitely made hires based on the guy who was the best kiss ass during the internship. And it turned out that had I attached any metrics to how I evaluated performance, I would have ended up with somebody with a better work ethic than I did. They just knew how at the time to look really good with the boss. So that's one piece I want to make sure that we got in here, because that's why this is important to me in my mind as it relates to gym owners.
Yeah, I think it's really wise. I think one of the things I'm hearing you say there, I think is worth underscoring, is that the data helps tell a really important part of the story, and it's not the only part. Right? Yeah, like that. What were you going to say, Fisher? I think I cut you off.
The flattery thing is hilarious, because there's unfortunately pretty conclusive research that even if you know someone is lying to you, you're going to be persuaded by it, which is maddening. But that's why I contend if one is looking to be successful as a business person, a very serious study of cognitive psychology and evolutionary psychology for all the flaws of that sort of soft social science is warranted, because consistently they've shown if somebody is just aggressively, clearly, insincerely nice to you, you cannot help but be persuaded, right? And then you also have the other effect, perversely. Sometimes you have somebody that is in theory very, very valuable, but their tone is like horrible and they're real challenging to be around. And maybe you can make a case that's bad for the culture, but sometimes somebody can give you really, really valuable feedback, but it's just if they're constantly coming with you with complaints and things they don't like, even when they're valid, over time, you can't help but not like them. You're just going to dislike them over time, right? And should employees be listening, I want to put this on your radar, as I must say, and maybe I can hope and pray that this is a reflection of a positive thing about me that people always felt being candid with me. But it has at times baffled me how that dynamic of the boss is technically the one in charge of your compensation, your performance, has not always reflected the way I think some people have at times treated me. And I don't mean to say that anybody's a horrible person by any means. And again, I do think part of this is we really have strived to create a culture where people are really candid and like just say the thing. And they don't all the time. And people lie to me and they don't always say the things that bothers them. And they say it to other people and I'm even madder because I hear it secondhand. But on balance, I've just had many interesting experiences where it's like, I don't know that I would ever speak in quite that tone, in quite that way to somebody who's in charge for my compensation performance. Not that I would hope that I'd be somebody who would be candid and speak truth to power. And Lord knows we have many. I mean, I want to shout out Amanda Wheeler. I miss so much. She was like so amazing because she was never shy. She was never, but she was always like nice, and always felt like cared for when she was like, hey, you've done a horrible thing here that's been a terrible mistake and everyone is mad at you. Be like, okay, thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that. I know you know it, but I really hope you see that as a compliment.
Yeah, I do. I really, honestly, really do. Right, because it's like
because it's so preferred to not being told.
It's so preferred, and I do try for what's worth on my end to, because I think that is a little bit of art as the leader, and for me, as Keeler well knows, part of my journey of like understanding healthy boundary setting, right? Because the last thing you want to do is shut that down and start tone policing your team and being like, well. Yeah, that's true, but I don't really like the way you said that because it hurt my feelings. Like, no, shut up. The answer is always, thank you so much. Thank you so much for, because it's always scary for them, right? It's so hard to, look up at the monkey on the top of the tree and be like, you're an asshole, And
Totally.
One of my favorite business books, this very quirky book called Up the Organization by Robert Townsend, who's the CEO of Avis. In the first chapter, he's like, as the CEO, you should hire someone to follow you around all day long and just yell, bullshit, because you're full of shit all day long. Just like, maybe not literally do that, but anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway,
that's amazing. Yeah, I think the only quick thing I'll add, and I've been using this analogy a lot lately, but I think of quantitative data as being like the tip of an iceberg that's sticking out of the water. It is the thing that we can all see and share and discuss, and it measures the obvious, viewable, observable things. And it's so necessary, and when you get it right, it can be so powerful at telling the story of what's working and not working in your organization. And there's a whole fucking iceberg underneath the water that is 20 million times bigger of things that are unsaid, unacknowledged, impossible to count. And I think while we and me all have time to dive into this in part 2 of this episode, I think that the way that we as leaders can make space for the conversation about what's underneath the water is just by asking, like, hey, as we're going through these key metrics, what else is going on this week that's not being told by these numbers? What else are people thinking and feeling this week that's not reflected in this assessment, right? And for us, just opening the door to a dialogue about what's happening that we haven't acknowledged, I think that's the first step. Just making space for a dialogue that's about more than what can be easily seen and observed.
Surfacing the onset, yes.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a theme for me, and I think the rest of my work for the rest of my life, so I'm going to keep talking about that on this podcast. But I think especially when it comes to a conversation about quantitative data, which feels so definitive, I want to make sure it's clear that it's important and it can be definitive, and it's still only ever part of reality, which is infuriating and true. Yeah.
Reality is so slippery. It's such a slippery thing.
It's so slippery. Yeah. All right, gents. Well, this was a great conversation. As we mentioned, we have probably more to say about this. We actually covered more ground than I thought we would, but there will probably be a part 2 in which we invite other people to this conversation. But thanks for the great chat. And dear listeners, we'll see you on the next one. Have a good one.
Thanks, guys.
Well, I hope you loved today's podcast, and forgive me, I want to remind you one more time, if you haven't already done so, head over to businessunicorns.com, click the button, and get your free self-assessment, the ultimate training gym owner report card. I promise you're going to want to dig into this resource and get the support you need, finding crystal clarity on exactly where you need to be focusing to create a life and a business you love.